Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Camera Rolling podcast. I'm your host, Ronnie, and today I'm going to be talking about Mean Girls 2. But before we do that, I first wanted to introduce myself to you. Again, my name is Ronnie, and I currently run a few other channels here on YouTube. My main channel is Ronnie Page, where I upload mental health, crochet, and lifestyle content. I also run Ronnie Bean, where I re-upload my edited Twitch streams. I play a lot of games from my childhood and Honkai and Genshin Impact. More personally, I have a bachelor's in cinema and a writing certificate. But enough about me, let's talk about movies. Before I get into today's topic, I actually want to do something that I plan to do with every episode, but I want to talk about some of the recent movies that I've watched because I do watch a lot of movies in my free time. I recently watched The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I was mostly inspired by Stephanie Harlow's deep dive into the case that inspired it, and I have to admit it made me think a lot about mental illness and its connection to religion. And I'm considering doing an episode about it in the future because I do think it's really interesting. I also watched the movie Dark Water. It's a horror based on a Japanese movie, and I have to say it wasn't that bad, at least for a Western adaptation of a Japanese horror. I also watched the movie Hell Baby. It's a comedy horror, but of course it follows the same trope of a family moving into a haunted house. It can be kind of crude at times, but overall it wasn't too bad. Alright, so let's jump into Mean Girls 2. Of course, over the past few years, Mean Girls 2 has garnered a lot of negative attention. And if you've seen the movie, you might understand why. It's not a surprise that a sequel so far removed from its original didn't receive the kind of positive attention that it may have wanted. And I think there's two main analyses of this movie, but they're both very different, but still valid. And with most sequels, you'll find that you can either compare them directly or view the second one as a standalone movie. So in terms of comparing the two, I want to make four main comparisons today. I want to compare acting, budget, writing, and execution. Starting with the acting, the original Mean Girls, or I'll call it Mean Girls 1 just to save time, you have two upcoming actresses in the industry at the forefront of the movie. You've got Lindsay Lohan, Disney's sweetheart from The Parent Trap, and in the previous year was in Freaky Friday, which are both remakes that ended up shaping an entire generation of children into thinking that those were in fact the originals. And you can see from both of these comedies that she has range in terms of her comedic acting. Then you have Rachel McAdams, an up-and-coming actress. She was in The Hot Chick only a few years prior, so she's established that she can play popular girl, blonde hair, skinny 2000s look. At the same time, she's also filming The Notebook, filming them at the same time as Mean Girls. However, on the other end, you've got Mean Girls 2 with actresses that are mainly TV actresses. You've got Megan Martin. She was a Disney Channel actress from Camp Rock and recently did 10 Things I Hate About You, which is a TV series that premiered on ABC Family, which is also where Mean Girls 2 premiered. And I would assume that she probably had a contract with them or was in good standing with them, so she was definitely like one of the main contenders to be at the forefront of Mean Girls 2. So she has this contract, she's easy to access, and before that she was on Disney. And I noticed actually that she hadn't really acted before 2007, which was only 4 years prior to Mean Girls 2. Then, of course, you've got Jennifer Stone, another Disney Channel actress from Wizards of Waverly Place. And then you have Mayara Walsh, who's also been on Disney Channel before with Cory in the House. She's also been on a few ABC Family shows, I think, as smaller roles. And I bring up these particular comparisons not to say that these actors aren't good at acting for their lack of experience, but more so that their experience speaks to the way this movie's acted out. And this movie is acted out like a TV movie. because it is. You'll find that TV movies don't tend to have the budget or time to create a complex story arc, nor do they have the resources to accomplish that. Much of the goal of a TV movie is to be entertaining for free. I say air quotes around free. You get what you pay for. Moving on to the budgets of these films, which I sort of touched on here a few minutes ago. My main comparison is that you have Mean Girls 1, this large budget of a film, then you have ABC Family Channel money. So with Mean Girls 1, you've got a budget of $17 million and they made $130 million. So they did pretty well for themselves. You've also got it distributed by Paramount Pictures. So when it comes to production, you've got this big company behind them, but you've also got a producer at SNL who wanted to pick up Tina Fey's idea because she'd pitched it before and it hadn't quite hit. But you did have, one producer who believed in Tina Fey's idea enough to have her work on it and produce it as a film. You can really tell with where this movie is coming from that this was a real passion project for Tina Fey. Then you get to Mean Girls 2. I couldn't find a budget, but I'll talk about that here in a second. Paramount Home Media distributed this movie. And while you may think, well, that's the same as Paramount Pictures, it's actually not. Paramount Home Media is kind of like a subcategory underneath Paramount Pictures, so they probably don't distribute these kinds of movies as widely as you would as a giant corporation. These movies are not going to theaters, they are home movies. Then you have Paramount Famous Productions that produced the movie. And it's interesting when you look at Paramount Famous Productions, they only actually produced a handful of movies before shutting down. This was actually their final movie that they produced under that company. And their initial plan was to produce movies that were made for TV, kind of based on originals, for less than $10 million. So we could probably gather that Mean Girls 2 had about half or less than half of the budget of the original. And this might explain why it seems a little rushed and underdeveloped. Speaking of underdeveloped, let's talk about the writing for both of the movies. One of the main things that I look at when I look at a film's quality is the writing, because what characters say and what their intended actions are all start with how the plot is conceived. So with Mean Girls 1, we all know Tina Fey. She was at the forefront of this. It was a passion project. She had been working with and writing scripts for SNL for 7 years prior, and at that time she had 30 Rock in the works at the time. So it's very clear that Tina Fey was a seasoned writer, and to make a comedy like Mean Girls it only makes sense given her experience. Then you have the co-writers for Mean Girls 2. You have 3 different writers. You've got Allison Schroeder. She was mainly a co-writer on TV and TV movies, and while her experience is with screenplays and their development, it doesn't seem that she's taken a central role on a project of her own. Then we get to the 2 kickers, Ilana Lesser and Cliff Ruby. They are or were married, and both writers on 2 different children's animated TV shows. It seems they've never worked on or written for a show that wasn't made exclusively for children. Thus, you can see how maybe some of the writing might not be as nuanced or have dialogue that is driven by both comedy and lived experience in Mean Girls 2. It was definitely written like kind of a Christian appropriate Mean Girls. This comes into play specifically in Mean Girls 2 when we have promiscuous characters like Claire Holt's Chastity, when instead of making fun of purity culture, it actually upholds it by both treating her character as dumb or less than, and by making her character seem changed for the better, I use air quotes, changed for the better, by just abstaining from sex in the end. However, it's not a surprise when looking at the context of it being for ABC Family. And my final comparison is the execution. There are a few elements that are clear indicators that when compared to the original, you can see that the effort or the resources weren't put into Mean Girls 2. For starters, the music. In Mean Girls 1, they featured some notable artists like Pink, or covers of songs like One Way or Another, Milkshake, or Dancing with Myself. And all of them are used to express a specific angle or sentiment within that scene. It's kind of like when you think about She's All That, and you think of the scene where she walks down the stairs to be seen by Freddie Prinze Jr. The song playing in the background is Kiss Me. It's pretty self-explanatory what the sentiment is in regards to that scene. It's the first moment where he thinks, I could kiss her. Whereas in Mean Girls 2, there's no notable songs except for maybe Hot and Cold by Katy Perry, but it's unfortunately used so poorly. It doesn't actually add much to the scene that it's in. It only stands to be background noise in introducing the Mean Girls.
At North Shore, they were called the Plastics, and Mandy Weatherly was the #1 plastic.
It reads very much like a purist's idea of what a bad girl song would be, because at the time, Katy Perry's other releases like I Kissed a Girl made her somewhat of a bad girl in those types of communities. I think that in itself would be such an interesting thing to dive more into, but I have a lot more to talk about. So another thing that I think comes with execution is wardrobe. Wardrobe should always tell a story. Look at any well-made film, you will see that the wardrobe tells a very specific story throughout the entire thing. For Mean Girls 1, you can actually find interviews with the costume designer for Mean Girls where she talks about how she specifically uses colors and styles from the time period to tell how Katie slowly is consumed by the plastic mentality. She goes from baggy, nondescript clothing to tight tanks and miniskirts. And unfortunately, Mean Girls 2 is very much a product of its time. Fashion trends of 2011 are not looked at favorably and have not come back around yet. But none of the outfits are iconic in any way. You can ask me what anyone was wearing at any given time because I really have no idea. A lot of the outfits match, but they don't stand out from one another. There's some subtle differences between characters, like in the plastics, but it doesn't exude confidence or even approachability in a way that Regina's outfits always did. People didn't realize how dangerous Regina George was because she never claimed to be, and she never showed that she was. She exuded confidence in the way that she talked and walked and acted. But even so, it never mattered what she was wearing. She still wore clothes that were like what everybody else was wearing, per se. When you think of the iconic scene where she walks out of the locker room with the 2 holes cut out of the boobs, and all it is a white tank top. And you wouldn't expect someone popular to wear something so simple, but because she's so confident, she would have rocked it whether there were holes in there or not. I think a great example of a sequel or a reboot that was actually sort of favorable was Jumanji. The original takes place in 1995 with a stacked cast having Robin Williams, an amazing story as well. Then you have the reboot in 2017, over 20 years later, with a completely different cast, but sort of similar story arc. And I think that the second one, or the newer Jumanji, works because it works as a standalone, but uses the original as a stepping stone. It's a reimagining with the same quirks as the original, along with recognizable faces, like The Rock. And because Mean Girls 2 is technically a standalone because it doesn't continue the story from the original and only has one callback character, which is Principal Duvall, it works a little bit more to view it as a standalone instead of in comparison. So now I want to analyze Mean Girls 2 as a standalone. If I was watching this movie without any prior knowledge of Mean Girls, what would I think? My opinion would heavily rely on context, plot, and overall quality. For context, this movie was released and distributed by ABC Family, which is what I mentioned earlier. ABC Family generally shows PG to PG-13 rated content. They also show original TV shows and original TV movies. And generally with ABC Family, they're more focused on the overall storyline. There's no subtle themes, just mostly direct plot lines. And with the budget, resources available to them, and audience in mind, it's not likely that they'll produce a show or movie that has big budget time put into it. While Harry Potter is a big budget film, it's also a family favorite or a teen favorite on weekends or for fun gatherings, so they would show that kind of content on ABC Family. However, something like Teen Spirit are generally what you'll find on TV during the day or weeknights when people kind of just tune in for background noise. So, you could say that the expectation for Mean Girls 2 isn't very much when you turn on ABC Family, which I know is now freeform, but it's really unrelated to this conversation. But when you turn on ABC Family, you expect to find movies broken up by commercials, maybe some fart humor, and subtle suggestions to inappropriate things. You probably aren't going to find as much nuance within any of the stories as you might with a big budget film. And like I mentioned before, the writers on Mean Girls 2 are not writers that have worked on projects by themselves, concocted a lot of intricate plot lines. They generally just work on children's content. The next thing I look at is overall plot, and I want to ask 3 main questions about it. Number 1, do the things that happen make sense within the universe? I would like to say no. Mandy is a bad villain. She's not subtle or creative in any of her tactics. She plays teenage boy type of pranks, and when she ruins Joe's dad's business, it's easy to see that she's just a dumb rich girl. She has no concept of money or how to use it, or what it means to not be rich, because that kind of setback for someone without money is humongous. It feels very much like the writers were writing a Swiper Dora situation where the antagonistic situations feel like something a child would think up. Likewise, the resolve of the main conflict between the 2 cliques is to have a game of powder puffs, which is just like flag football. This whole arc comes out of nowhere and has nothing to do with anything. They don't even really mention football as a main source of entertainment throughout the high school or the movie itself. However, before we get to see who wins and loses this game, the villain in this story, Mandy, suffers huge consequences for her actions. Mandy is literally arrested on the football field and put into a cop car, which feels so serious in comparison to everything else that's happened in this movie. Because when Joe gets revenge earlier in the movie, she makes a guy puke and steals party goers for Abby. The consequences for certain actions in this movie just feel out of proportion. They even have a dance which only comes into play when they talk about money, but there are really no other stakes going for the dance or the dance itself. There's no larger importance to why you would want to have a dance or why anyone wants to go to the dance. And I know I'm trying not to compare, but at least in Mean Girls, the spring fling held a very great significance. Everyone wanted to be queen. It was a status symbol. It was to show that you were the most popular girl in school. And with that, they consistently mentioned spring fling queen, and who's going to go with whom. It was a very large point of contention for all of the characters. And within that, it's a huge example of how they used events and places as a motivating factor within the high school hierarchy war. Whereas with Mean Girls 2, they don't really use their dance as a point of contention. Nobody really talks about it until the very end. And when they do talk about it, it just has to do with the funds for it. They don't talk about who's going with whom, and they don't try to like make these great feats to make everyone hate so-and-so or to like so-and-so so they can be the queen. No one really cares about the dance overall, it seems. Question 2. Does the main character have a driving force behind them? Jo's main desire is to make it through the year so she can go to her dream college. One of her main obstacles is her monetary issues. She finds out that her dad is not going to be able to pay for her to go to that college because he had to spend money on cars and his business and all of that other stuff. He had to reach into that to help maintain the business. So the movie sets up that her dilemma will be about money and how to get it, but then immediately solves it by offering it to her through a morally debatable situation, which can only be coughed up to being rich. You'd have to be delusional as an adult to ever offer a minor that kind of money just to be friends. And this is where some of the logic in the movie kind of evades me. I'm not sure if overall the movie's not supposed to make sense, or if it's even really supposed to take place in reality, because this genuinely doesn't make any sense. And I personally think that Jo and Abby would have become friends either way, because Jo has a good heart and Abby desires authenticity despite her circumstances. She continues to just be herself. While scared, she still continues to be herself, and so does Jo. And so with both of them being pretty authentic people, it's not a surprise that when Abby gets her stuff knocked into the trash can and it's gross and there's stuff all over it, that Jo wouldn't offer a helping hand. Another thing is that Jo doesn't have any desire to engage with the conflicts that Mandy poses, but does so to try to help others or to defend herself. She doesn't really have any personal involvement with her, and not being liked by her only results in a lot of minor pranks. You could say that it becomes personal when she goes on a date with the, I think, stepbrother, and then the information that she's a virgin is like circulated throughout the student body by Mandy, and that's when it becomes personal. But I'd say that when Mandy ruins her stuff, her dad's business, that's when it becomes extremely personal, which, like, I think it would be for anyone. But before that, it just doesn't seem like she has any reason to actually engage with her, or even why it would really matter what other people think about her sexual history if she claims to be this loner who doesn't care what people think. I don't know why she would care about that information. And number 3, does the movie uphold the themes that it presents? So of course the general themes of the movie are about high school hierarchies, like the first one. The high school hierarchies are never actually broken in this movie, but instead upheld by the end, where Mandy is still considered all bad and Jo is considered triumphant. I also made the comparison earlier with Chastity and her sexuality, and similarly, Jo finds blatant sexism when the shop teacher and her partner treat her like less than. The movie still gives her internalized misogyny. Like, Jo continuously makes comments and jokes about hyper-feminine looks like cheerleading or Mandy's clique, and the movie just seems to think that she is right.
She dotted her name with the signature heart above the I, probably because she didn't actually possess that organ.
The movie continues to uphold this misogyny by villainizing hyperfemininity. And again, by the end, the hyperfeminine loses while this quote-unquote not like other girls stance is upheld. And finally, I want to talk about the quality. I mentioned a lot in my comparison about the quality of this film, but there's a few more that I want to touch on quickly. The first is the narration. The narration serves its function, but really only acts as a telling instead of showing moment. While the first one also has narration, this one feels much different. It feels more like a diary entry instead of an addition to what's going on.
I'm 16, and until today, I was homeschooled. I know what you're thinking. Homeschooled kids are freaks.
XYLOCARP. Stylocarp. Because of his work, I changed schools 2 times a year for the past 8 years. This doesn't make me a loner with a highly evolved defense mechanism or anything. Okay, fine. It does.
However, I see where they were trying to go with all of the racing metaphors and analogies. I understand that aspect of it, and I'll give that to them. And the other thing I'd like to touch on is the camera work. The lighting and camera work all feel a bit rudimentary. The angles and color scheme are just a bit blah. There's a lot of fluorescent lighting, even in scenes that are supposed to feel cool and luxe. The plastics never actually stand out amongst the crowds that they're in. They also just don't stick out within the scenes because their costume design is so one note. They often just wear pink and white and purple in different patterns with ruffles or too many cheap accessories. And unfortunately, 2011 couldn't pull off the cheap look because it wasn't keeping it simple. Much of the early 2000s fashion was considered to be sort of on a more accessible side because it was just a simple tank and sweatpants, but it was considered to be cool because people were wearing Gucci from head to toe. Let's pretend like they were wearing Gucci even though they weren't, but they still had cheap, accessible style. The scenes that would be considered iconic, like Mandy crushing her coffee, or Tyler pouring water all over himself, or the plastics making their entry, all feel really flat. The camera angles and movement are not dramatic. The lighting and framing are both a little subpar by any movie standards outside of maybe TV movies. Much of the camera work for Jo doesn't feel like we're actually following her, but we're taking a back seat. I feel a lot of distance from her because we're not seeing things through her eyes for the first time for most of the movie. I also noticed many of the scenes don't have a lot of depth. They have a foreground and a background, but they don't really have sort of this middle area that's full of anything. Even within crowded scenes, it feels like there is someone at the forefront and someone in the background, but nothing in between there. I also noticed that we don't spend a lot of time on reaction shots. It really does have a very rudimentary classic back and forth without much overlap. If you'll notice within, honestly, any movie, but if you want to compare it directly to Mean Girls 1, you'll notice that there's a lot of reaction. Take the first lunch scene where Regina is talking to Katie, and there's a lot of this back and forth. But you'll notice that Regina will be talking, and Katie is sitting there she's reacting to what she's saying, but we don't need to see Regina saying what she's saying. Whereas if you notice, a lot of the talking in the scenes for Mean Girls 2 is very much just back and forth. Whoever's talking is who's on the screen. For my conclusion, I think when you have two very different movies like these two, it's easy to want to compare them. But I feel like when you look at interviews for Mean Girls 2, you'll see how excited everyone seemed to be when working on this kind of project. So I don't want to say that there was no effort or even little effort made on their part to make this a good movie. I think the context of the resources that were available to them are more of what made this movie a flop. When you have a movie as iconic as Mean Girls to live up to and you want to make an addition per se, it's hard to do it even if they'd had a larger budget. It's hard to please an audience that grew up with a certain piece of media, just like it's impossible to please book lovers when you make a book into a movie. I think because they didn't have the time or resources to get a writer like Tina Fey back on this project, or to shoot for a larger production company, or to have more influence with the movie actors, movie writers, or just the distribution in general, you end up with a project that feels rushed and out of place. You end up with a movie that has no finesse. The idea that B movies or bad movies just in general can't be critically analyzed because what's the point is consistently proven wrong by the fact that there are literal college graduates like me spending time formulating essays to prove that it is in fact a bad movie, but not because we just hate it in general because it's not like the original, but because there are certain factors that play into it being a bad movie. There are certain standards that you have to look at when it comes to quality. Even though it is in fact a bad movie, it's not necessarily a movie that we can no longer enjoy or laugh at or give our time. I think Mean Girls 2 can be enjoyed as both a failure of a sequel, but a success within a TV movie context, because I can assure you that there are probably a lot of Mean Girls fans who have seen Mean Girls 2. They know that it exists. All this to say, I think Mean Girls 2 is a bad movie worth watching. It becomes more watchable as you discover the environment in which it was conceived. It's not a failure of Mean Girls by extension. I think it's more of a success of ABC Family on its own. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first episode of the Camera Rolling podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow. Let me know down in the comments more movies you'd like me to talk about. With that, keep watching, and I'll see you next week.